director. It was Kang-sheng's first film as an actor. I know Kang-sheng was around 24 when he made this film. Tsai he graduated about a decade earlier from Wenhua University and had worked in the film industry, television industry, and theater. This was your first film. And so my first question is, as a kind of origin story, what were the factors that brought you together and made this film possible? And how did this film come about? And how did you meet? So we'd love to have a little bit of that backstory.
这是你导演的第一部片子，也是李康生主演的第一部啊。能否先简单的介绍，就是当年你们如何认识，然后这部片子就是背后的是怎么产生的
？OK， 时间有点久啊，
It's been a while
一晃也已经32年了，30多年了这个电影当时我在1991年的时候还是一个电视导演我当时在拍一部短的电视剧，大概60分钟的那种电视剧，我需要一个演员是一个坏小孩所谓坏小孩就是在社会新闻上面出现的那种勒索小学生被高中生勒索的那种事件我要找一个坏小孩坏学生但是我一直没找到大概要开拍前的1个礼拜，我就决定了用一个学戏剧的学生但是不知道为什么隔2天我就还没拍拍前的1个礼拜我在看一部电影，我记得是大卫林区的电影那个电影叫《我心狂野》，我不知道怎么办然后我看完那个电影走出来在街上就遇到李康生，他坐在一个摩托车上面，车是停下来的，就很多停了一排车在那个骑楼上面他坐在上面抽着烟手上拿着一个大概那个对讲机吧然后我当时跟一个朋友在一起，我就跟我的朋友说，这个人的样子蛮好看的，我想问他要不要演我的戏，我就跟我那个朋友一起过去，我就问了李康生说，先表明我是个导演他尽情的听我讲话我想找你演戏，你有兴趣吗？你有兴趣你可以打电话给我，我就给了他一个电话他说他好像也没说什么，大概是这样子。
So, in a flash, it's been a long time. So we're going back 32, 33 years. At the time, around 1991, I was a director for television, and I was, I had directed a few television, kind of made-for-TV films. They were like 60 minutes long. And at the time, there was a project I was working on for television that I needed an actor for. And I needed an actor that was kind of a bad boy, someone who had been up to a lot of mischief and up to no good. And it was really hard for me to find someone. We were actually just a week before the shoot began, and I still hadn't cast this role. Finally, at the 11th hour, I found a drama student to play the role, but I still wasn't that happy with it. And I happened to go to the movies, and I saw a film, Wild at Heart. And I was watching it in the Ximending area of Taipei, that's where this film takes place. And as I came out of the movie theater, I saw this guy, this young kid, kind of hanging out on his motorcycle, smoking a cigarette. There was just something really kind of cool about him. So he had this aura that really drew me in. And I happened to go to a friend, we saw the movie together. So I said, maybe I should ask him to be in the show. And so, I approached Kang-sheng and I explained that I'm a film director, a TV director, and asked him if he had any interest in being, acting. He didn't really say much, but I gave him my card, I gave him my phone number, and said, if you're interested, call me.
他就好像是隔1天他就来了到我的办公室来，我刚好有一个小演员在，就是跟他对戏的一个小演员在办公室里面，我就我们来试一下戏。我记得是在电梯里面 在楼梯啊，在楼梯间，我就用它了，我就决定用它。
And so I had him come to my office. There was actually another actor present that they were going to share a scene with. So I had them go through the scene. The scene took place in an elevator, and Kang-sheng interrupted, said, "Oh, it was a stairway." Okay, it was a stairway. And so we tried out the scene, did a run through in the stairway where he's kind of threatening this kid, and immediately I knew this was the line. I cast him right there.
拍片的过程，我印象最深刻的是康生的表现。开始的3天让我非常不满意。
And what left the deepest impression when we first started working together were those first 3 days, because I was very dissatisfied with what I was seeing.
总之，我就觉得他很慢。
You're just so slow.
有一个镜头是他在户外要回头的一个画面，我总觉得他太慢了，反应太慢。我一直跟他讲说要再快一点，然后我说要再自然一点。结果大概NG 了几次，他就跟我说，我还是催促他说，再快，不然有点像机器人。他后来就回了我一句话，他说这就是我平常的样子。然后我就没说话，我就 OK 了，不知道为什么我就 OK。我相信那是他平常的样子。
And so, there was a scene, an exterior shot, where he had to turn around, and I kept feeling like the rhythm, the way in which he turned around was just too slow, and it just didn't feel natural. I kept telling him, can you do it faster, a little more natural, and it could flow a little better. It's like a robot, there's just something so tense about the way you're doing this. And I remember it very clearly, he turned around and said, this is just how I usually behave. This is just how I usually behave. I didn't say anything in response, but I kind of got it.
所以91年我就跟小康合作了那个电视剧，叫小孩。我那个时间我得了一些电视的奖，不久就有一个电影公司，也是台湾最重要的一个电影公司，叫中央电影公司，他们拍了许多李行导演的戏、侯孝贤的戏、杨德昌的戏，他们那个公司的总经理是一个电影图书馆的馆长，以前是馆，所以他认识我。学理工但是我们没有很亲密他就打电话给我，问我要不要当一个导演，要不要拍戏，要就写剧本给他。
And so that work that we completed, the TV, it was completed in 1991. It was called The Kid. That was broadcast, and it wasn't much long after that came out that there was a film company in Taiwan at the time called Central Motion Picture Corporation, CMPC. And that was a famous studio that had produced films by directors like Li Xing, Hou Xiaoxian, Liang, and many other luminaries. And at the time, the head of CMPC was a man named Shu Yibong, who got his start as a chief librarian, but eventually he came to CMPC, and he got in touch with me. He had seen The Kid and said, hey, if you have any interest in maybe shooting a film for us.
我想起来那个时候，整个台湾的电影状态不是很好，从那种商业片的那种一年生产300部的状态变成大概只有10几20部的状态因为所有电影都不卖钱国产片都不卖钱，所以那个时候他们急需要用一些新的导演所以我就受到邀请，但是我没有非常积极，我是一个比较慢，我也是慢的人。大概拖了1年，学理工打了很多次电话问我剧本在哪里这样子。我那时候反而去开了一个咖啡店，我去卖海南鸡饭，所以就不太理他。后来当时我还记得我跟他说，我想来拍一个电影是那种男女情欲的戏，一个电影 起来，那我也写不下去。可是那时候我已经认识李康生了，我忽然间有一个感觉，我觉得我应该认识李康生的家庭，我就去拜访他他的才比较亲密的在一起，怎么讲呢？比较靠近的，知道他的家庭是那种老兵的家庭，他的爸爸是一个从中国撤退到台湾的，很年轻的时候撤退到台湾，49年的时候，然后娶了比他年轻的台湾太太，就像你今天看到这个家庭的状态是一样的，我就忽然间，那时候李康生是一个重考生，然后准备要考大学，考了2次没考上，还在准备，所以我就觉得我应该来拍一个关于李康生的家庭的电影。
So Xu Lingbo came to me about this film. At the time, the Taiwan film industry was not doing very well. Not much a bit earlier, they were making 300 films a year. But by the time we get to the early 90s, the industry is really in a state of crisis where maybe a dozen to 20 films a year are being produced. And so part of the policy to try to reinvigorate the industry was bringing in fresh blood, new directors with a new vision. So that's part of why Xu Lingbo came to me during this time. But maybe I'm like Shao Kahn in some way because I'm also kind of slow. So I wasn't aggressively pursuing this opportunity when he came to me. And actually I was running a coffee house, we were selling Hainan chicken rice, and and I wasn't spending a lot of time working on this project. And Xu Lingbo came back to me after a while and said, hey, where's the screenplay? Don't we want to make this film? And I hadn't really worked on the screenplay. And I thought, well, maybe I'll write a romance, like a kind of typical romance film. But I kept thinking about it, and I said, you know what, by that time I already knew Li Kang-sheng, but I really didn't know his family, and I was really interested in exploring what his family was like. So I got in touch with him and asked to visit his house, his apartment, to meet his parents. And his father is actually an old veteran who came from the mainland in 1949, and once he came to Taiwan, married a much younger Taiwanese wife. And there was something about that family dynamic that really interested me, and I started moving in a direction to maybe make the film about Shao Kahn's family. As you can see in Rebels of the Neon God, the family that's portrayed there, that's not his real parents, but that's the same dynamic, an old veteran with a younger Taiwanese wife.
1年后我就拍了《青少年的他》。
So a year later, we made Rebels of the Neon God. How about Shao Kahn? Do you want to talk a little bit about what were you doing before Tsai Ming-liang discovered you? 就是在蔡导演发现你之前，你生活状态是你处在什么样的一个状态？
大概就像戏里面这样。对，我就考大学考了2年，然后我是前半年在电动玩具店里打工，对，为了要赚补习费，所以我后半年是去补习班补习。
我遇到他就在打工。
So it's actually pretty similar to what you see in the movie. I was in that area around Ximending, working in an arcade, these video game halls, trying to save up money because I had tried to get into college twice and didn't make it in terms of the entrance exams. So I was going to these cram schools, just like you see in the film, and I was working in the arcade to save up money to pay my tuition. And Satai added, yes, that's where I met. He was working at that time.
那我打工之前是在有2年嘛，1年是在那种夜总会当少女，就是跳交际舞的那种地方。对，然后第2年，因为我选择的是我要离开随时可以走的这种工作，对，然后第2年就跑去赌博性的电动玩具店，对，赌博性的，所以我在外面，我在内场做得很好，然后他们看我很机灵，就把我调到外场去。外场就是拿个对讲机，看到警察来， 就叫里面赶快把铁门拉下来，对，然后所以我在那边，我上班的时候几乎都在街上上班，对。
So at the time, I'm working in Ximending. For the first year, I actually worked at these kind of nightclubs where there's dancing and things, and eventually I transitioned to this kind of arcade, but the type where you gamble. And I guess they liked the work I was doing because eventually they promoted me. They sent me out to the streets to be the one to be on guard for the cops when they come. And so I spent a lot of time just kind of hanging out on the streets. So I want to ask about, this is your first film, but already so many of the kind of core elements of your style are there, and so many of the kind of symbolic elements. For instance, the eavesdropping, the three-person family, the apartment, the rain, the flooding. These are all elements that we see over and over again in your films, and I was curious. At this early stage, did you already imagine that you would come back to these over and over again? Or was it after this film you decided to revisit them? 虽然这是你第一部片子，不过你后来
从那个地下的那个水管冒起来的，很奇怪的，没有什么原因，找不到原因那种漏水，所以我很习惯把这种生活的东西放到我的创作里面来。
So I started out in theater as a theater director, and at that time, most of the theatrical works I directed, wrote, were based on my own life and had this kind of autobiographical dimension where I was reflecting what I was going through, themes like unrequited love, the kind of emotional world of young people at that time during that era. Later, when I transitioned to television, I would say my early TV works had a much stronger realist tone and were much more heavily rooted in reality. There wasn't even that much of a need for a screenplay because a lot of it was based on these observations of youth culture, what was happening just in the world at that time. So I had the habit of going to these places where young people frequented, like roller skating rinks, movie theaters, video game parlors. Not like I was interested in playing video games, but I got a lot of interest out of just observing the lives of young people and see what their life was like. Because there weren't a lot of films or TV shows at the time that really captured that and presented that. And so, as I mentioned, I originally wanted to make up my first film about this kind of yuppie love, but that didn't happen. It transferred into this story about Kang-sheng and his family. And it was also during this time that I'm moving all the time. I didn't own my own house or apartment, so I'm constantly going from place to place to place, renting different apartments. And I realized everywhere I rented, they were always leaking. I always had those chronic leaks, and sometimes the water would surge up from the drain, just like we saw in the film. And there was no reason for it. It was inexplicable. I couldn't figure out why, but this kind of thing was always happening. And so I like to take these elements of everyday life and incorporate them into my work. How about the family? You said a little bit about it being modeled on Shang Kang, but these three actors, Liang Tian, Lu Yijing, and of course Li Kang-sheng, they form the core of your films for so many years. And I would love to hear both of you talk about the relationship between the three of them. Maybe we can start with Shang Kang about your collaborative kind of relationship with Liang Tian and Lu Yijing. 就是你们在这部片子的三个人一家三口，这个两天的陆毅静这个家庭，一直这是往后的十几年一直不断的合作。不知道是否可以先请李康生谈谈你跟那个廖老师跟那个陆毅静的合作关系，还有在经过这么多年，你们的合作关系有经过什么样的一个转变？
好像就是从青少年谋杀开始，然后一直到。
A very close relationship, and we would eat together, we would hang out, and it wasn't just on screen, but in real life. We also interacted a lot, and there are people that I very much have deep respect for.
我觉得是青少年的在开始我就我觉得是一个引擎作用，我就一直我对李康生家庭或者对李康生这个 还有一个事件非要讲不可，是李康生在拍完《青少年的长》的1个月后，他生了一个怪病，他的脖子歪了，他来找我，然后这个我就带着他看医生，大概花了10个月的时间，而且是他的爸爸跟我一起带着他去看医生，看各种中医、西医，到最后是求神拜佛，什么东西都去想办法要治好他的脖子歪的这个怪病，所以我们很亲密，我们3个人蛮亲密的，所以脖子歪的后来是发展成河流，所以我的电影是跟生活还有跟我看到的生活是密不可分的一种状态。
So when we started working on Rebels of the Neon God, we had this this idea of that the family was already in place, and it was actually less the 3 of them, but I think it was really Li Kang-sheng himself that drew me in, that most excited me. You know, I think they were a typical family. They lived in a very typical apartment. You know, it was a 4-level building with no elevator. There's a lot of Taiwanese families living in very similar circumstances. But the more I kind of observed them, I really realized that it was Li Kang-sheng that somehow was drawing me in and really fascinated me. And I had to ask myself why. What was it that I was so just hypnotized by? And I think it has to do with my own father. My father passed away about a year after Rebels of the Neon God was completed, and I think, you know, my father is the kind of person that was very, you know, we loved each other, but we didn't really express that, and I think he didn't express it to me, I didn't express it to him, and there was always this kind of rift where we couldn't really have that emotional connection. And somehow, Li Kang-sheng had certain qualities that reminded me of my father. He smoked just like my father. The way he smoked was just the same way my father would hold a cigarette. And I felt like, if I really want to self-analyze, it's almost the process of transference, where I kind of direct the emotional attachment that I had to my father and feelings about my father to Li Kang-sheng. And I think that's a big part of what was happening. Another facet of this, and this goes into the next film we're going to be talking about tonight, The River, was that about a month after we finished Rebels of the Neon God, Li Kang-sheng fell ill. He had a strange neck ailment, and it just wouldn't go away. It lasted about 10 months. And during those 10 months, me and Shang's father took him to see all kinds of doctors and specialists, Chinese medical specialists, Western doctors. We went all over trying to get to the bottom of this and give him some relief. And it was during the process of that that we became very close, both to Kang and his father. And that experience eventually evolved into what became the film, The River. And so I'm a big believer in using these life details and incorporating them into my work and into my films. And so I just got the sign that we have a few minutes left, and so I have endless questions, but why don't I give... So aesthetics is very central to my feelings about film, and I think that's true for most film directors, but it's also very different for every film director. I think every director has a very different definition and understanding of what aesthetics are and how they function in their films. For me, the mise-en-scene, all of the way the shots are set up, that's so central for me, and the kind of structure of the image, the way all of the pieces fall together, that is probably more important for me than the drama. So rather than the, say, dramatic tension, it's the structure of the image that is more central for me. From early commercial films of my youth to later more art house films, and of course that includes the French New Wave, the German New Wave, Italian neo-realism. But unlike a lot of mainstream audiences who go to the movies to see stars, I go to films to see directors, and my viewing habits are very
driven. But if I go back and think back to my childhood, I could even start at the age of 3 years old and start recounting the films chronologically that had such a big impact on my life. And, I remember when I was 3, this is in the early 60s, I saw a film called Dreyu, which was a kind of fantasy film produced out of Shanghai. I remember that had a big impact on me. If we go to the present, more recently, not so many. There was a recent example. There was a film I saw at a film festival. It was an Argentinian director. I can't remember his name. And the film, in literal translation from the Chinese, is called The Lost. I don't know if anyone knows what the. Did you say that loud? Los Muertos. Okay. So that is a film that he saw recently. He recently was talking actually to the curator here and figured out the title of the film. But that's a recent one that he saw that usually not terribly impacted by recent films. How about I don't know if you guys know, but Shao Kahn is also a film director. Starting, I think last night you saw Goodbye Dragon Inn, and that's actually a couplet. In Chinese it's called Busan, but actually in Chinese there were 2 films, Bujian, Busan. Bujian was directed by Shao Kahn, and Busan was directed by director Tsai, and he's continued to make films intermittently over the years. So I also wonder if Shao Kahn could talk about his influences. 就是小康你也是导演嘛，那能不能你也分享一下，就是对你影响最深刻的导演或者电影有哪些呢？
应该就是蔡导，对我来说。
I suppose it's Tsai Ming-liang. Maybe that's a beautiful note to wrap up on, because I'm getting the cue that we're almost out of time, and there is the river that's coming out. And there's a scene in the river between Shao Kahn and Yao Tian, which last time I interviewed Tsai Ming-liang several years back, he told me this entire body of work, it's the scene that he was most excited about, most proud as a filmmaker. And so I don't know if he still feels that way, but you should wait and see the river tonight, which I think is really one of the great masterpieces of both Kang-sheng and Tsai Ming-liang. So unfortunately we're out of time, but please join me with a very robust round of applause. We really appreciate it.